Welcome back to our channel, where we dive deep into the minds of history's most fascinating figures. Before we embark on today's psychological journey into the complex mind of Christopher Columbus, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss our explorations into the human psyche that shaped our world. Today, we're not just telling the story of a man who sailed across the ocean in 1492. We're peeling back the layers of one of history's most controversial and psychologically intriguing figures. Imagine for a moment being so utterly convinced of something that everyone around you thinks is impossible, so driven by a vision that you're willing to risk everything, including your life and reputation, to prove it. This was Christopher Columbus, a man whose psychological makeup was a fascinating blend of visionary genius, relentless ambition, religious fervor, and what many modern psychologists might identify as narcissistic tendencies. Born around 1451 in the Republic of Genoa, Columbus grew up in a world where the known universe ended at the edges of Europe, Africa, and Asia. His early years as a sailor and his exposure to maritime trade shaped not just his skills, but his entire worldview. What's particularly fascinating from a psychological perspective is how Columbus developed what we might call selective perception. He read ancient texts, studied maps, and absorbed information, but he had this remarkable ability to filter everything through the lens of his own beliefs. When he read about the size of the Earth, he chose to believe the smallest estimates. When scholars told him Asia was much farther away than he calculated, he dismissed them. This wasn't mere stubbornness. It was a psychological defense mechanism that protected his dream from the harsh reality of doubt. The psychology of Columbus reveals a man driven by multiple motivations that intertwined in complex ways. Yes, he sought wealth and glory, but dig deeper, and you find a man who genuinely believed he was chosen by God for a divine mission. His writings are filled with biblical references and prophetic interpretations. He saw himself as the bearer of Christianity to new lands, the fulfiller of prophecy. This messianic complex gave him an unshakable confidence that bordered on delusion. Modern psychology would recognize this as a form of grandiosity, but in Columbus's time, such religious conviction was not only acceptable but admirable. He spent years trying to convince monarchs to fund his voyage, facing rejection after rejection. A normal person might have given up, but Columbus's psychological resilience was extraordinary. Each rejection seemed to strengthen his resolve rather than weaken it. When Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand finally agreed to sponsor his voyage in 1492, Columbus's psychological state shifted into what we might call hyperfocus mode. He became obsessed with every detail of the journey, from selecting his crew to choosing his ships. The Santa Maria, the Pinta, and the Niña became extensions of his will. During the voyage itself, Columbus displayed remarkable psychological manipulation skills. When his crew grew fearful and threatened mutiny, he kept two sets of logs, one showing the true distance traveled and another showing less, to prevent panic. This deception reveals a calculating mind that understood human psychology well enough to manage fear and maintain control. The moment of landing in what he believed to be the Indies showcases Columbus's most prominent psychological trait, which was his confirmation bias. Despite clear evidence that he had not reached Asia, including the absence of the great cities described by Marco Polo, Columbus insisted he had found a new route to the east. The indigenous peoples he encountered didn't match descriptions of Asians. The flora and fauna were completely different, yet his mind refused to accept the truth. This wasn't simple stubbornness, but a deep psychological inability to abandon the narrative he had constructed about himself and his mission. He had staked everything on this belief, and to admit error would mean psychological collapse. Columbus's treatment of the indigenous peoples reveals the darker aspects of his psychology. He saw them through a lens of European superiority, describing them alternately as innocent children to be converted and as potential slaves to be exploited. This cognitive dissonance, holding contradictory views simultaneously, is a fascinating psychological phenomenon. He could write beautifully about their generosity and peacefulness while simultaneously planning their subjugation. Modern psychology might identify this as a form of compartmentalization, where different moral standards apply to different groups of people. His writings show a man who genuinely believed he was bringing civilization and salvation to these peoples, even as he enslaved and brutalized them. The later voyages of Columbus reveal a psychology increasingly under strain. As governor of the new territories, he proved to be a harsh and ineffective administrator. His inability to manage colonists, his brutal punishments, and his continued insistence that he had found Asia despite mounting evidence to the contrary, all point to a man whose rigid psychological framework couldn't adapt to new realities. When he was arrested and sent back to Spain in chains in 1500, it triggered what appears to have been a psychological crisis. His writings became increasingly mystical and apocalyptic. He began compiling a book of prophecies, convinced that his discoveries were part of God's plan for the end times. The psychological impact of Columbus extends far beyond his own mind. He fundamentally altered how Europeans saw themselves and their place in the world. Before Columbus, Europe was a relatively small player on the edge of the known world. After Columbus, Europeans began to see themselves as discoverers, conquerors, and bringers of civilization. This psychological shift had profound consequences that rippled through centuries. The concept of manifest destiny, the white man's burden, and other ideologies of expansion and colonialism can trace their psychological roots back to the mindset Columbus embodied and promoted. Understanding Columbus's psychology helps us comprehend not just a man, but an entire era's mentality. His combination of religious certainty, cultural superiority, and unshakable self-belief created a template for exploration and conquest that would be repeated countless times. Yet we must also recognize the human cost of this psychology. The indigenous peoples of the Americas paid an unimaginable price for Columbus's dreams and delusions. Millions died from disease, slavery, and violence. Entire cultures were destroyed. This wasn't just the result of historical forces, but of individual psychological traits like Columbus's inability to see indigenous peoples as fully human equals deserving of respect and dignity. In our modern era, Columbus presents a psychological case study in how heroes are made and unmade. For centuries, he was celebrated as a visionary hero, and this narrative shaped collective psychology in the Americas. Columbus Day became a celebration of discovery and courage. But as our psychological understanding of colonialism and its impacts has evolved, so has our view of Columbus. We now see him as a complex figure whose psychological makeup included both remarkable determination and disturbing cruelty. This shift in perception reflects our own psychological evolution as societies grappling with historical trauma and seeking more inclusive narratives. The legacy of Columbus's psychology continues to influence us today. The debate over Columbus Day versus Indigenous Peoples Day is fundamentally a psychological struggle over narrative, identity, and values. How we remember Columbus says as much about our psychology as it does about his. Do we celebrate the courage to pursue impossible dreams, or condemn the arrogance that justified exploitation? Can we hold both truths simultaneously? These questions challenge us to develop a more sophisticated psychological understanding of history and its figures. As we conclude this psychological portrait, remember that Columbus was neither pure hero nor pure villain, but a complex human whose psychology was shaped by his time while also transcending it. His story reminds us that individual psychology can change the course of history, for better and worse. If you found this psychological exploration enlightening, please subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the minds that shaped our world. Share your thoughts in the comments about how you view Columbus's psychological legacy. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the fascinating complexity of human psychology. The psychological transformation that Columbus underwent after his first voyage reveals perhaps the most fascinating aspect of his character development. When he returned to Spain in 1493, he was no longer merely an ambitious navigator, but a man who believed he had fulfilled divine prophecy. This shift in self-perception would fundamentally alter his psychological makeup for the remainder of his life. The adulation he received at the Spanish court fed into what psychologists today might recognize as a growing narcissistic tendency, but it was more complex than simple ego inflation. Columbus began to see patterns and signs everywhere, interpreting natural phenomena as divine messages meant specifically for him. During his second voyage, which departed in September of 1493 with 17 ships and over 1,200 men, his leadership style had dramatically changed. Where once he had been collaborative with his crew, he now became increasingly autocratic, believing that his divine mission gave him absolute authority over both Europeans and indigenous peoples alike. The psychological burden of maintaining his constructed reality became increasingly heavy as reality began to diverge from his expectations. When he established the colony of La Isabela on Hispaniola, he demonstrated a complete inability to adapt his grand visions to practical realities. His men were falling ill, supplies were running low, and the promised gold was nowhere near as abundant as he had claimed. Rather than adjusting his approach, Columbus doubled down on his beliefs, insisting that the terrestrial paradise was just beyond the next island, that the gold would appear if they just searched harder. This cognitive rigidity, this inability to update his mental models based on new information, speaks to a deep psychological need to preserve his self-concept as God's chosen instrument. Modern psychology would recognize this as cognitive dissonance at its most extreme, where the mind works overtime to protect core beliefs even when confronted with contradictory evidence. His treatment of the indigenous peoples during this period reveals another disturbing psychological pattern. Columbus seemed to oscillate between viewing them as innocent children of nature who could be easily converted to Christianity, and seeing them as obstacles to his divine mission who needed to be subjugated or eliminated. This psychological splitting, where people are viewed as either entirely good or entirely bad, with no middle ground, suggests an increasingly unstable mental state. He instituted a system of forced labor and tribute that was brutal even by the standards of his time, requiring every indigenous person over 14 to provide a certain quantity of gold every 3 months, or face having their hands cut off. The psychological compartmentalization required to reconcile this cruelty with his self-image as a Christian, bringing salvation to the New World, speaks to a profound capacity for self-deception. The third voyage, beginning in 1498, marked a critical psychological turning point. Columbus claimed to have discovered the location of the biblical Garden of Eden at the mouth of the Orinoco River, describing the earth as shaped like a pear with a nipple on top where paradise was located. This wasn't merely colorful metaphor, but a genuine belief that reveals how far his psychology had departed from conventional reality. He wrote extensive letters filled with mystical interpretations, numerical calculations based on biblical prophecy, and elaborate theories about his role in ushering in the end times. His handwriting from this period, preserved in various archives, shows increasing instability, with wild variations in size and pressure that graphologists interpret as signs of extreme psychological stress. The psychological impact of his arrest and return to Spain in chains in 1500 cannot be overstated. For a man who had constructed his entire identity around being divinely chosen, being treated as a common criminal triggered what appears to have been a complete psychological breakdown. Witnesses described him as alternating between periods of intense religious fervor, where he would wear Franciscan robes and speak of nothing but scripture, and periods of bitter rage where he would rail against the Spanish crown for their ingratitude. He began compiling what he called the Book of Privileges, obsessively documenting every promise made to him, every title granted, as if by preserving these documents he could preserve his disintegrating sense of self. His fourth and final voyage from 1502 to 1504 represents the tragic culmination of his psychological journey. By this point, Columbus was experiencing what modern psychiatrists might diagnose as a form of reactive psychosis brought on by chronic stress, possible neurosyphilis, and severe arthritis that left him in constant pain. He reported hearing divine voices, seeing celestial signs, and experiencing visions. Stranded on Jamaica for over a year, he wrote increasingly desperate and grandiose letters, claiming that God had spoken to him directly, comparing his sufferings to those of biblical prophets. His ability to accurately predict a lunar eclipse to intimidate the local population shows that his navigational intelligence remained intact even as his broader psychological framework crumbled. The psychological legacy Columbus left behind extends far beyond his personal mental state. He established psychological patterns that would be replicated by countless European colonizers. The ability to dehumanize others while maintaining a self-image of moral superiority. The use of religious justification for economic exploitation, and the projection of European fantasies onto American realities. These psychological mechanisms became embedded in the colonial mindset, creating what scholars call the colonizer's psychology, a complex of superiority, entitlement, and selective blindness to suffering that would shape centuries of global history. Columbus didn't invent these psychological patterns, but he was among the first to deploy them on a hemispheric scale, creating templates for rationalization and justification that would be used to defend slavery, genocide, and cultural destruction for generations to come. Understanding Columbus's psychology helps us comprehend how individual mental processes can scale up to historical forces, how one man's delusions and drives can reshape entire civilizations, and how the stories we tell ourselves about our actions can become more powerful than the actions themselves in shaping historical memory and cultural consciousness. The transformation of Columbus from man to myth reveals perhaps the most fascinating aspect of his psychology, his desperate need to control his own narrative, even as reality crumbled around him. During his third voyage, as his governorship of Hispaniola descended into chaos, Columbus began experiencing what modern psychologists might recognize as dissociative episodes. He would spend hours writing elaborate letters to the Spanish monarchs, crafting alternative versions of events where native rebellions were signs of hidden gold mines, where his failures were actually victories misunderstood by lesser minds. This psychological defense mechanism, this ability to create parallel realities in his mind, became more pronounced as his actual power diminished. When Francisco de Bobadilla arrived in 1500 to investigate reports of tyranny and mismanagement, he found Columbus had ordered the execution of Spanish colonists and implemented a reign of terror that shocked even hardened conquistadors. Yet in Columbus's own writings from this period, he portrayed himself as a martyred saint, comparing his sufferings to those of biblical prophets. This wasn't simple lying. It was a complex psychological process where Columbus genuinely seemed to believe his own fabrications, a phenomenon psychologists now call confabulation, where the brain creates false memories to fill gaps or protect the ego from unbearable truths. The arrest and chains that Bobadilla placed on Columbus triggered what appears to have been a complete psychological break. During the voyage back to Spain in chains, Columbus refused to have them removed even when offered, wearing them as symbols of his martyrdom. He began writing increasingly mystical texts, including his Book of Prophecies, where he claimed his voyages were divinely ordained steps toward the end times, that he was chosen by God to reclaim Jerusalem with gold from the Indies. This messianic complex intensified rather than diminished after his humiliation, suggesting a psychology that transformed external defeats into internal victories through religious reframing. Modern trauma psychology recognizes this pattern. When reality becomes too painful, some individuals retreat into grandiose fantasies where their suffering serves a cosmic purpose. Columbus's mind seemed to fracture into multiple narratives running simultaneously, the practical navigator still planning routes and calculating distances, the mystical prophet receiving divine visions, the bitter old man nursing grievances against those who had wronged him, and the delusional optimist still convinced that one more voyage would vindicate everything. His fourth and final voyage exemplified this psychological fragmentation perfectly. At 51 years old, partially crippled by arthritis and what historians believe was reactive arthritis or Reiter's syndrome, possibly caused by food poisoning or infection, Columbus set sail with a mind increasingly untethered from reality. He spent this voyage searching for a strait to the Indian Ocean that he was convinced must exist in Central America because his cosmological calculations demanded it. When storms battered his ships and his crew faced starvation, Columbus claimed to have heard divine voices directing him. He wrote letters describing conversations with God, visions of gold mines revealed by angels, and prophetic dreams about his destiny. Yet simultaneously, he demonstrated remarkable seamanship, navigating through hurricanes and unknown waters with skill that saved his crew multiple times. This cognitive dissonance, the coexistence of competence and delusion, challenges our simple categories of sanity and madness. Columbus operated in a psychological space where practical skills and mystical thinking intertwined so completely that separating them becomes impossible. The indigenous peoples who encountered Columbus during these later voyages witnessed a man whose psychology had become increasingly alien and unpredictable. The Taino people had developed sophisticated psychological profiles of the Spanish, understanding their gold obsession and using it strategically, sometimes inventing stories of gold in distant lands to make the dangerous strangers leave. But Columbus's behavior defied even their adaptive strategies. He would shift from gift-giving to violence without warning, interpret friendly gestures as signs of submission, and see divine messages in natural phenomena that the Taino understood as simple weather patterns. This psychological instability made Columbus even more dangerous than calculatingly cruel conquistadors who followed. His unpredictability meant that no amount of compliance or resistance could guarantee safety, creating a reign of psychological terror that broke down indigenous social structures through sheer uncertainty and fear. The lasting psychological impact of Columbus extends far beyond his personal madness into the collective psychology of colonialism itself. He established what psychologists call cognitive templates, mental frameworks that subsequent generations would use to process similar situations. The idea that indigenous peoples were naturally suited for slavery, that European diseases decimating populations was divine will, that cultural destruction was actually salvation. These weren't just ideas, but psychological structures that allowed ordinary people to participate in extraordinary horror while maintaining their self-concept as good Christians. Columbus's writings provided the vocabulary and conceptual framework for 5 centuries of colonial psychology, where exploitation could be reframed as education, where genocide could be seen as God's plan, where theft could be called discovery. Modern Italy and Spain's relationship with Columbus reveals how his psychology continues to influence contemporary cultural identity. During the 1930s and 40s, both Mussolini and Franco claimed Columbus as a symbol of national greatness, using his story to justify their own imperial ambitions. The psychological need to claim Columbus, despite his probable Genoese origins being peripheral to unified Italy, despite his expeditions serving Spanish rather than Italian interests, shows how his myth fulfills deep psychological needs for national pride and historical significance. Even today, Columbus Day celebrations and protests reveal competing psychological needs: the desire for heroic origin stories versus the need to acknowledge historical trauma, the comfort of traditional narratives versus the discomfort of moral reckoning. These aren't just political debates, but psychological processes, where entire societies grapple with cognitive dissonance between cherished myths and documented realities, exhibiting on a cultural scale the same kind of reality. Denial that Columbus himself displayed on an individual level, proving that his most lasting discovery might have been the human capacity to maintain contradictory truths simultaneously without psychological collapse. This psychological paradox extends far beyond Columbus himself, revealing something fundamental about how human minds process uncomfortable truths about their heroes and histories. When we examine the modern psychological aftermath of Columbus's legacy, we discover that his story has become a mirror reflecting our own cognitive biases and emotional needs. Psychologists studying historical memory have found that people who strongly defend Columbus often score higher on measures of system justification, the psychological tendency to defend existing social arrangements even when they produce inequality. This isn't about intelligence or education, but about deep psychological comfort with hierarchical worldviews that Columbus himself embodied. His certainty that European civilization was inherently superior to indigenous cultures wasn't just racism, but a psychological framework that made exploitation feel like benevolence, a mental gymnastics that continues in various forms today. The fascinating aspect is how Columbus's psychological profile has become a template for understanding other historical figures who combined genuine achievement with moral blindness. Modern neuroscience suggests that the same brain regions activated when we experience physical pain also activate when we encounter information that threatens our worldview, which explains why debates about Columbus can feel so visceral and personal. His defenders aren't just protecting a historical figure, but defending against the psychological pain of reconsidering foundational narratives about progress, discovery, and civilization itself. This defensive response mirrors Columbus's own psychological defenses against reality, creating a centuries-long chain of cognitive dissonance passed down through generations like psychological DNA. What makes Columbus particularly interesting from a psychological perspective is how his delusions became productive in ways that rational thinking might not have achieved. Psychologists call this positive illusion, where unrealistic optimism and inflated self-assessment actually lead to greater achievement. Columbus's grandiose belief that he was divinely chosen, his refusal to accept geographical reality, and his messianic complex all represent psychological dysfunctions that paradoxically enabled historic action. Modern entrepreneurs and innovators often display similar traits, suggesting that certain forms of psychological imbalance might be evolutionarily selected for their ability to drive extraordinary behavior, even when that behavior causes tremendous harm. The transmission of Columbus's psychological impact through educational systems reveals how collective psychology shapes individual development. Children learn about Columbus during crucial developmental stages when they're forming concepts about the simplified narrative of brave explorer discovering new worlds, imprints psychological patterns that influence how these children will later process complex moral information. Studies show that early exposure to heroic Columbus narratives correlates with adult difficulty accepting indigenous perspectives on colonization, not because of conscious prejudice, but because of deep psychological schemas formed in childhood. This demonstrates how one man's 15th century psychology continues shaping 21st century minds through educational storytelling. Columbus's journals reveal a fascinating psychological phenomenon that modern therapists recognize in narcissistic personality structures: the simultaneous grandiosity and fragility. His desperate need for titles, gold, and recognition wasn't simple greed, but a psychological hunger that no amount of success could satisfy. This insatiable need drove him to increasingly desperate measures, including enslaving natives and exaggerating his discoveries, behaviors that make sense only when understood as attempts to feed a psychological void that material success could never fill. Modern psychology recognizes this pattern in many high achievers whose external accomplishments mask internal emptiness. The way different cultures remember Columbus provides a natural experiment in collective psychology. In parts of Latin America, Columbus represents the beginning of mestizaje, the mixing of peoples that created new identities, a psychologically complex position that acknowledges both trauma and transformation. In the United States, he became a symbol of immigrant achievement when Italian Americans promoted his celebration to combat discrimination, showing how marginalized groups can psychologically identify with controversial figures to claim belonging. Indigenous communities' relationship with Columbus's memory involves what psychologists call transgenerational trauma, where psychological wounds pass through generations via epigenetic changes, family dynamics, and cultural memory, making his perhaps most remarkably, Columbus's psychology anticipated and shaped the psychological framework of colonialism that would dominate the next 5 centuries. His combination of religious certainty, cultural superiority, and economic motivation created a psychological template that justified exploitation while maintaining moral self-conception. This psychological model proved so powerful that it survived the Enlightenment, scientific revolution, and even modern human rights movements, adapting but never fully disappearing. Understanding Columbus's psychology helps us recognize these patterns in contemporary forms, from economic imperialism to cultural appropriation. As we conclude this psychological portrait, we must acknowledge that Columbus remains psychologically alive in ways that few historical figures achieve. He exists not just in history books, but in ongoing psychological processes of identity formation, moral reasoning, and cultural memory. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable psychological truths about heroism, progress, and the human capacity for both achievement and atrocity. The question isn't whether Columbus was good or evil, but how his psychology reveals universal human potentials that exist within us all. Understanding his mind means understanding the psychological forces that shape history, forces that continue operating today. Thank you.